In early 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexis I sent envoys to ask Pope Urban II for aid in the defense of his empire from Turkish invaders and to help reclaim the lands taken from the empire. Pope Urban, possibly hoping to heal and reunite the churches that split after the Great Schism in 1054, listened to Emperor Alexis's call for help. In mid-1095, Pope Urban II went to his country of birth, France, in order to recruit armies for the crusade. This rallying cry ended with Pope Urban forming the Council of Clermont in late 1095. The Council of Clermont was a sermon in which Pope Urban II told French clergymen and nobles of the atrocities committed by Muslims to Christians. Pope Urban called for a war in which the world had never seen before. He insisted that in order to maintain the peace of God, Christians must respond to the Byzantine Emperor's call for help with an armed pilgrimage in order to save Christians from savage Muslim attacks. Pope Urban II also declared that any who died in this crusade would be granted remission of all prior sins and the rewards of eternal heaven. After the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban had the support of two important French leaders, Adhemar, Bishop of Courtrai, and Raymond IV of Toulouse. For most of 1095 and 1096, the Pope urged all his bishops to spread the message of the crusade to their dioceses in Germany, Italy, and the rest of France. At first, Pope Urban did not want to include the sick, the old, women, or monks from taking up the crusade against the Muslims, but it was they who took up the cross first instead of the knights of Europe. The peasant armies lacked what the formal military training, education, and wealth that the knights of Europe had. Even though they lacked resources and knowledge, their faith carried them and urged the peasants to take up the vows of the crusade. This vow swore that the pilgrims had to reach the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. After they took up this vow, the pilgrims put a cross on their clothes to show their faith and their vow. With Adhemar, Raymond, and the pilgrims, other leaders were drawn into the armies of Christendom. In 1096, Bohemond of Taranto, his nephew Tancred, Godfrey of Bouillon, Godfrey's brother Baldwin of Boulogne, Hugh of Vermandois, Robert of Normandy, Stephen Blois, and Robert of Flanders all joined the Christendom armies to begin the crusade. The army of Christendom was quite large, with 35,000 crusaders. Due to its size, the armies were divided into 4 separate armies in order to help better manage the army. The army was divided into the army of northern France, the army of southern France, the army of Germany, and the army of southern Italy. However, before the main crusade was to happen, the army of peasants and a few lower-ranking nobles set off for Jerusalem before the main armies of Christendom. This peasant army was under the leadership of Peter the Hermit, a fanatical preacher of Pope Urban II's message of the crusade. These armies lacked military discipline and attacked many people on their way to Constantinople. Most of the people attacked were Jews, but some Christians and even Byzantine citizens and guards of Constantinople were attacked as well during their resupply by Emperor Alexis. After the misconduct of the peasant army, Emperor Alexis quickly began transporting the army to Asia Minor. When Peter the Hermit's armies finally landed, they were quickly slaughtered by the more experienced army of the Turks. Most of the army was killed in the Battle of Zergorden in August of that year, and the rest were killed in an ambush en route to Nicaea. Peter and the remaining 3,000 or so of his initial 20,000 crusaders fled back to Constantinople and would later link up with the main Christendom army. As the main Crusader armies marched towards Constantinople to meet up, many more Jews were killed along the way. Hugh of Vermandois was the first to arrive at Constantinople, followed by Godfrey, Raymond, and Bohemond. Unlike the previous army that arrived at Constantinople, military discipline reigned in the camps, and very little bloodshed occurred between the armies of Christendom and Byzantine. Byzantine Emperor Alexis, weary of how the last Christendom army acted, quickly transported the Crusader armies out of Constantinople to ensure that the Crusaders would not get unruly while encamped outside of his city walls. Before the main armies left, Alexis required that the leaders of the army of Christendom take a loyalty oath and promise to return land that was taken from him by the Turks. Godfrey was the first to take this oath, and majority of the leaders swore their allegiance to Emperor Alexis. However, Raymond instead only as the Christendom armies crossed into Asia Minor in the early half of 1097, they were soon joined by the remnants of Peter the Hermit's army and two of Emperor Alexis's generals. Byzantine generals Taticius and Bodomides were sent with the Crusaders in order to assist with strategy and leadership, and to provide information on the Turk armies. The city to be attacked first was a former Byzantine city, Nicaea. After being captured by the Turks from Byzantine, the city was made capital of Seljuk Sultanate of Rum underneath Khalij Arslan I. Arslan, after destroying the People's Crusade that had landed earlier, was in the middle of a war with Danishmends in central Anatolia and left the Nicaea city behind after greatly underestimating the new Crusader army. When the Crusader army began to siege the city, Arslan quickly returned to the city to attack the Crusader armies, only to be pushed back. The city could not be fully blockaded during the siege due to a lake that could help resupply the city, which then prolonged the siege of Nicaea. When Emperor Alexis sent ships to help the Crusader armies blockade the city, the Turkish garrison stationed in Nicaea surrendered. Nicaea was returned to Byzantine, and the Crusaders set out for Jerusalem. As the Crusader armies departed, they separated into two armies. One was led by the French, while the other was led by the Normans. The two armies planned to meet at Dorylaeum, but a reinforced army led by Arslan attacked the early arriving Norman army. The Norman army was surrounded and had to deploy into a tight defensive formation in order to protect their equipment and all the non-combatants that had accompanied the Crusaders on their quest. The Normans sent for help from the nearby French army, and the French army responded by breaking through the lines of the Turks. The Turks opted to flee instead of facing off with the entire Crusader army, leaving the march through Anatolia virtually unopposed. However, Arslan adopted a scorched earth policy while retreating, and destroyed anything of value for the Crusader armies. Many Crusaders and their horses died due to the scorched earth policy, due to lack of food and water. During this time, Baldwin of Bouillon set off to Edessa and was able to convince King Thoros to adopt Baldwin and make him the heir to the throne of Edessa. Soon after, Thoros was assassinated, possibly by followers of Baldwin, making Baldwin the king and creating the first Crusader state, the county of Edessa. The Crusader army continued to march until they reached Antioch, which was in between Constantinople and Jerusalem. In October 1097, the Crusader army began the 8-month siege of Antioch. During the siege, two large relief armies under the command of Dukak of Damascus and Ridwan of Aleppo were defeated by the Crusader armies. In May of 1098, Bohemond bribed a guard to surrender his tower that was defending against the Crusaders' siege. This then led to the victory for the Crusader army and the slaughter of Antioch's inhabitants. Within a few days of the end of the siege of Antioch, a Muslim army began to lay siege to the Crusader-inhabited city. In June, the Muslim army was defeated outside of the city, leaving Antioch in Crusader hands. The Crusaders stayed in Antioch for the remainder of the year as the nobles argued amongst themselves as to who could claim Antioch. It was during this stay at Antioch that a plague broke out and killed many of the Crusaders. The nearby peasants refused to give the Crusaders any food, which led some to resort to cannibalism. The lower-ranking Crusaders, tired of the nobles squabbling and arguing, threatened to continue to Jerusalem without the nobles. The nobles came to a conclusion, leaving Bohemond behind and making him the Prince of Antioch. They then began their march to Jerusalem in early 1099. In June, the Crusaders arrived at Jerusalem and quickly went to work, sieging the city. At this point in time of the crusade, it is estimated that of the 37,000 Crusaders that had started the journey, only 13,500 were left. By mid-July, the Crusaders had taken the city, and shortly thereafter began to slaughter many of Jerusalem's citizens. Muslims had taken refuge in Al-Aqsa Mosque, while the Jews decided to hide in their synagogue in the Western Wall. When the Crusaders found both the Jews and the Muslims, almost all were killed. At Temple Mount, the slaughter was so massive that it is said that the Crusaders were up to their ankles in blood in some areas, and even up to their knees in bridle mounts in others. A week after the Crusader conquest of Jerusalem, a council came together and appointed Raymond of Toulouse to become the king of Jerusalem. Raymond, however, refused, possibly out of piety, and Godfrey instead took on a secular leader position of the city. This angered Raymond, who then left Jerusalem with his army. Godfrey then became the leader of Jerusalem, but later died in July 1100, which made his brother, Baldwin of Edessa, king of Jerusalem. This ended the First Crusade. In 1101, a minor crusade was put forth to help reinforce the newly conquered Jerusalem. This was mainly made up of the Crusaders